Good afternoon, guys. We're going to begin our last breakout session. We just wanted to thank you all so much for being here again. We're going to be having, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Omid Fotuhi. He works at WGU Labs, and he's a research associate at the University of Pittsburgh. So he's going to be heading up our last breakout session. He's going to have an incredible presentation for you guys, and please help me welcome Dr. Fotuhi. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. Last session. I don't know how I feel about that, but thank you all for being here. I can't promise you anything. What I will say is that I'm married to a psychologist whose area of expertise is on apologies. Now, you might think, oh, cool, but then let that sink in for a second about what that means for me. On a day-to-day basis, there's some challenges, but one thing that is good is I've learned a strategy that's never failed me, and that's sort of proactively apologizing for anything that's about to happen. If you get bored, if this is the last session, my apologies in advance for all of that. I should really apologize because I am a scientist and I am very tempted to anchor heavily on data. I've been told to try not to do that as much as I do, but I can't make any promises. And so hopefully what we'll do is do a good balance of large conceptual ideas mixed in with some of the data that supports those ideas. What we'll be focusing on today is this notion of belonging. Some of you might be wondering why belonging. This is a resilience conference. Did you not get the message? But hopefully by the end of or midway, we can start to see the connections between this work and the work that many of us are thinking and talking about today. Let me take a big step back and tell you a little bit about what first inspired me to go into psychology. So I was a young child. My parents at the time of about 10 years old started to separate, and as any 10-year-old child might do in terms of coping with that separation, in trying to understand how the world that's falling apart around them tries to find ways to make meaning of the world that is close to them. So from a very young age, I sort of fell into the habit of taking apart appliances around the house and trying to understand how they work. Most of the time, I would not get them back together, but that was not the point. At a very early age, too, one of the things that I realized is that the things that work all around us, the washing machines, the cars, the things that actually create movement are fueled not by the hard stuff, but by the invisible stuff, the energy that goes into it, the electricity that feeds into them. And that's really when I first fell in love with the invisible. So a lot of people ask me, what do you do? And the best answer that I have for that question is that I look for the invisible. And I look specifically for the invisible questions that people ask themselves at critical times in their journeys of academics or performance. And so my goal here today is to give you a very quick insight or preview of what that work looks like, and hopefully by the end of it give you a sense of how to do that in your own work as well. So without further ado, let's jump in. I'm not sure if I have to click on something. Okay, so if I do my job well, which again, there's no guarantees, we'll spend about 45 minutes going over some content that helps to unpack the construct of belonging. There is a Q&A amount of time that we'll designate towards the end, but I also hope that you take the opportunity to interact and interject at any point. I have slides, I have content, but I'm happy to tailor it to what this group feels is most appropriate. And of course, if you have any questions, you're always welcome to email me. I should also say, going back, I learned this strategy too from a colleague that QR code is the only form of social media I have, which is a LinkedIn page. So if you want to stay connected, please just grab a picture of that, and we'll be automatic friends. Okay. In terms of what we'll be covering, I have three broad goals. So what I want to do is set the context of belonging. It's one of those terms that many of us have heard about, talk about, think about, but we don't always understand where it comes from or even what it means. And so what I'll hope to try to do today is to give you some better clarity about why it matters, what it is that drives us towards having a sense of belonging, and how it is that we might actually get closer to having a concrete and agreed upon definition of what belonging is and is not. I'll also connect that sense of belonging with what I mentioned to be the focus of what I think about all the time, which is the invisible questions, the ambiguities that we have to navigate as individuals. And finally, hopefully we have some time for some strategies to foster greater belonging. So, belonging. It begins pretty early in terms of the evolutionary history of our species. Now, when you think and look around, you see arguably the single most dominant species on the planet. Now, whether by divine design or evolutionary design, there was a pretty big gamble that had to be made in order to give us the unique adaptive advantage that allows us to be the most dominant species, specifically a relatively large head. In order for us to be born with the largest possible sized head, we actually have to be born at a stage that many will argue is actually premature, that there actually should have been a fourth trimester before we're even ready to hold up our heads or have any sense of being able to just fend for ourselves. But in order to maximize our brain size, we're born entirely helpless. We can't feed ourselves, we can't defend ourselves, we can't do anything. And the only way that you would imagine a species becoming the single most dominant species, being born in such a vulnerable state, is if we are born into a clan that will feed us, that will defend us, that will provide for us. So the basis of our survival is rooted in the fact that we are brought into a clan where we belong, that we are taken care of. That is the big gamble that has been made, and so far so good. But there are some interesting things that happen after the early stages of life that are important to think about. As you think about this core need of belonging, that is, again, the very basis of our survival and our species being the dominant species that it is, it follows us. We can't just detach from that fundamental root of belonging later in life. In fact, you'll argue, and I'll argue, that many of us are here doing the work that we do because in some shape, way, or form, it still fulfills that sense of belonging that we all have a need for. So this need to belong, as I mentioned, is one in which you are brought into a clan. You are accepted and you feel cared for and valued. And as we start to think about a definition of belonging, now I will say that I have been working with the leading researchers in the world on the topic of belonging for about 10 years. And I still have not found a single measure of belonging that consistently captures a sense of belonging for all students at all institutions and at all times. And the reason is because the single best definition of belonging that I've come across is that belonging is a feeling. It is a subjective experience that only matters whether you feel it. And so if we think about that and the implications of that for a moment, then we start to get a little bit closer to understanding how we can foster belonging. Now here's a bit of a spoiler. Because if you, and I often get asked, so being an expert on belonging, tell me what I should do as an institution, as a faculty member, as an advisor, to create belonging. And almost like you're waiting for a checklist of things that you do that should create a sense of belonging. It is the need to belong, not us telling students that you need to belong. And so understanding that belonging really is a subjective, inherent experience that can only live within the individual, hopefully will get us a step closer to understanding how we can create programs and strategies that fosters that belonging. Not assuming like just because we do our part that belonging needs to be automatically generated. Now, why do we talk about belonging? As I mentioned, it was very useful in our evolutionary development. But as we think about some of the foundational models of performance and really sort of success, we all know that belonging is at the very center of the hierarchy of needs. So once your physiological needs are met, your safety needs are met, comes love and belonging. What I've noticed, however, is that while no one in this room will argue that a student won't be able to focus if they're worried about having food in their stomach or whether or not they're physically safe, people still are not as convinced that a sense of belonging is equally important for their optimal functioning. These are basic fundamental needs that need to be nourished before we can start to think about those higher order levels of aspiration like esteem gratification and self-actualization. As such, excuse me, belonging literally is the gatekeeper of our core fundamental needs and those higher order aspirational domains of performance that we expect our students to demonstrate. So thinking about that and recognizing that hopefully will all get us a step closer to getting the outcomes that we need from our students as well. Now, where belonging develops, and one of the things that I like to think about a lot is social identity theory. Just bear with me for a second while I throw out some jargon. Psychological theory, the social identity theory suggests that we all occupy multiple identities, and at any given time, whatever identity we're occupying, we're concerned about whether that's negatively evaluated or not. And how we see ourselves is based on that perceived evaluation. I, for instance, am a speaker right now. When I go home, I'm a father. When I put on my running shoes, I'm a pretend runner. I don't even pretend to sing, so let's not even go there. But what's fascinating is that as we think about all of these identities, there's a very clear moment in which we are invited to experiment with that identity for the first time. And if that initial experience is positive, then we start to say, I am a presenter, I am a runner, I am a father. That one's harder to refute, but but if that first experience is not positive, what you see is actually all too common. So I work with student athletes a lot. And what's fascinating is when I work with athletes, I'll get an athlete come to me and say, speak about their sport and tell me all the complex calculations that they just executed under pressure to lead to a win. And then I'll ask them, how's it going in math class? And they'll shut down and say, sorry, I'm not a math person. Interesting, you just demonstrated the very core competencies of mathematics in this other domain, and yet you've convinced yourself, or someone's convinced you, that you're not this person. And as we think about how it is that people identify themselves, what they say they are and are not, it has to do with those early experiences, whether we are invited to play with these identities that we either end up occupying or the ones that we say are not me, and we exclude ourselves from those identities. So as we think about belonging and social identity theory, we start to see that this has a pretty powerful impact in the educational landscape. Now, if you look around, for instance, one of the great things that education has been able to fulfill in terms of its promise over the past 3 decades is that representation and diversity have significantly increased. That compared to 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, that there is much better representation in higher ed than at any other time in history. However, half of them are not graduating. And so as an institution, I would argue we're not really succeeding because getting them into the door is very different than making sure that they complete their investment and actually get the degree that they're looking for. And the reason, I'll argue, part of the reason, I'll argue, is that the current pedagogical model that we have inherited was not built for diverse groups of individuals. It was built for a very homogenous group of white men who knew what they wanted to do and what careers they wanted to have. So all they had to do was to be exposed to content that would give them the mastery that they needed to get access to those later outcomes. But it's not reflective of the diverse needs and the diverse experiences and the diverse groups that we are currently in the space of being able to support. And so, as Claude Steele says, this pedagogical model that we've inherited is lacking in one very fundamental skill. And that fundamental skill is perspective taking. Being able to understand and appreciate the diverse experiences that each individual student comes into that learning environment with, and what that means in terms of what their experience is like in that moment. I'll give you another example. I've worked with students when teaching and if I ever teach a morning class, you'll see this as well, I'm sure, that some students show up ready to learn. Other students show up looking like they're exhausted. And when you actually speak with these students, it turns out it's not for sort of benign reasons. One student woke up in the morning, they had warm breakfast to eat, they had the clothes to put on, and they basically just walked across campus to get to class. Another student, having just finished a night shift the night before, had to wake up extra early in the morning to either take their kids to school or take their siblings to school, then had to take an hour and a half to 2-hour bus ride to get to class. Both are there at the same time in the same place, but they're not really both in the same place to learn. And so without that understanding of the diverse experiences and situations that students come into that classroom environment with, we may not be able to serve them in the ultimate deliverable that we are responsible for delivering, which is learning experience. And so as we think about creating institutions that really are more supportive, we have to understand this need or this ability to perspective take and why that's important in fundamental ways. I've argued that belonging is a subjective feeling, and what I'm also suggesting now is that that perspective-taking skill is also one of the greatest ways to foster belonging, because if belonging is a perception that you are valued and cared for, what's the best way of inducing that? Telling someone that they belong, or actually asking them questions about who they are and what they care about, what they're feeling and thinking. That positioning of inquiry ends up being the best way of inviting someone to play safely, to experiment with that new identity, and to feel like they belong. So perspective taking actually is the single most effective, most powerful thing that we can do to instill a sense of belonging in our students. Now that's difficult work. It's work that's a little bit ambiguous because there's not one model or one strategy, but it does lead to the single most reliable way of fostering belonging that I've seen. I also want to take a second now to talk about the consequences of not belonging, because those are not insignificant. In order to do that, it's important, and I think about this way too much. As my brother likes to tease, I have an attention condition called APHD, which means that I go into way too much detail than anybody needs to know. But as we think about belonging and the various categories of belonging, there's actually different versions or different categories that have different implications. And so I'll list 3 of them here, and we'll go through which ones we think are most relevant. The first one that is a belonging-related problem is knowing that you belong, but not wanting to belong. Right? Like some people will go into a school if it was, their local higher ed institution where the enrollment or enrollment is sort of open enrollment, the standards are perceived to be low. They know that they belong to that institution. They know that they're accepted and they could be valued, but they don't want to because they look around, they say, my peers are not ambitious, they're not going anywhere, this is not where I want to be. Now, the consequence of this first category of belonging is that students will say, I don't want to be here, so I'm out of here, which means disengagement is the outcome. The second category of belonging that's also problematic is knowing for sure that you do not belong. Now, we know that some of our campuses across this nation are not entirely as supportive as we would like them to be, and sometimes there's overt and explicit incidences of racism or exclusion that happen where a student or a particular group of students will know for sure that they do not belong because they've been told that they don't belong. And again, the consequence here is disengagement. If you know for sure that you don't belong somewhere, you're going to say, I'm out of here, and disengage. Now, the third category of belonging, which is the one that we're going to spend a bit more time on, is belonging uncertainty. Belonging uncertainty is when you are in a context, but you are always wondering, do I or do I not belong? It's like that frenemy, right? Like you have a friend that you just don't know if they really care about you, but you still have to hang out with them in social circles, and it's taxing. You go home, you feel exhausted. And that's exactly what belonging uncertainty is. It is this additional tax, this additional burden that students have to carry, all the while having to perform and execute at the same level of other students. So we're going to spend a bit of time on belonging uncertainty and talk about why that's important and how that sort of plays out. Essentially, as we go through life, we all have a little interpreter sitting on our shoulder. And as events happen, let's say Joe gets a D in a math class. And Joe concludes, well, I got this D in math class because I must not have studied the right sections of the text. I'm going to talk to my teacher to find out how I can better study for the next test. Now Jane, who gets that same D, instead concludes, this is evidence confirming that I'm not smart enough. I don't belong in college, and I'm probably an admissions error. I should just drop out because I can't handle it here. The same exact event, two very different interpretations. Now what's going to happen to John? He's probably going to speak with his professor, ask his peers how to study, what to study, and chances are, on that next test, he'll do okay, if not better. Jane, in contrast, will not speak to her professor. She's already concluded, or is worried that she doesn't belong, is now going to do more poorly on that second test, and in turn will confirm her initial belief that I don't belong in college. I'm not smart enough. Belonging is interesting because it actually is sort of a catch-all for many different kinds of uncertainties and ambiguities that students have to navigate. And so if you do poorly academically, that questions your sense of belonging. But if you make these negative attributions about whether or not you do or don't belong, then you then fall into a series of recursive processes where the negative attribution impacts whether you do or don't engage, because it's safer not to engage if I don't think I belong. And then ultimately, the outcomes will be more negative, and then in turn, those initial beliefs will be confirmed, and that's kind of hard to undo. So we call this, again, a bit of jargon, attributional ambiguity. But essentially, if you had to break it down, students generally ask three categories of questions. Do I belong? When I feel lonely or disrespected, does that mean I don't? Can I do it? When it's hard, does it mean that maybe I can't do it? And does it matter? When it's boring, or there's no reason for me to really exert effort, should I even try? And how they answer these questions fundamentally will determine whether they engage or disengage. And disengagement is not what we want. We want students to make more positive attributions in the face of these events that occur so that they can stay engaged with the resources that are there, with their peers, with their faculty, so that they can have the outcomes that they've invested their time and money into. Now, where do these cues of belonging and certainty come from? As I've mentioned, there is a category of belonging where people are told explicitly and overtly that you don't belong, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about cues of belonging that are a little bit more implicit, a little bit more covert. And here I'm going to show you some studies that show exactly just how covert they can be. Where it is that students infer or draw the conclusions about their sense of belonging from their environment in this educational landscape. Here's a study that they did where they had men and women in computer science come into presumably a TA's lab office, and in the one condition, they had a bunch of things that you might expect in a TA's office, like a poster, sort of a sci-fi poster, some sci-fi books, and some Coke cans. In the other condition that students were randomly assigned to, so you either saw one version, men and women, or the other version, and the other version, they replaced some of these stereotypical cues with slightly more gender-neutral cues, like a nature poster, more neutral books, and water bottles. Now at this point you might think, what kind of message do you think that these cues are having? Well, it turns out that if you're a woman in a computer science field, and just imagine for a second what it's like. If you're sitting in a classroom where you are clearly the visible minority, where on a bad day, you want to just take a break from the class because you got a bad grade or the person sitting next to you is giving you some mixed vibes, and you want to go to the washroom, but the washroom is down this long hallway because your institution was not built for women. It was an afterthought, so the washrooms were placed in the very far corner. And as you're walking down this hallway and there is picture upon picture of old white guy, what are the cues that you're drawing from? Because when you're wondering whether or not I belong, you grasp onto anything that's there. And this is what happens when students are exposed to one of the two conditions, and then they're asked, how interested are you in computer science programs? But those in the conditions, the stereotypical cues, actually expressed lower interest in computer science compared to those who were in the gender-neutral cube. And notice almost that the women in the non-stereotypical condition almost had slightly more interest in computer science, absent those cues telling them that they do not belong. Here's another example. My colleagues and some of the researchers at UT, what they wanted to see was whether or not sort of mundane, day-to-day bureaucratic experiences that we all navigate also have an impact on students. So we've all gone through this. There's a web form that asks you to, for the first time, create an account, a username, a password, and then one of two things happen. You hit enter, and the system will generate some recommendations to strengthen your password, but it will retain all the information, or everything will be erased, and then you've got to start over. Now, we all know how frustrating that is. Like, it's just, but this was the manipulation. In the one condition, the information did not disappear. In the other condition, all the information disappeared because of this sort of unwritten rule about how to create a password. And what the researchers wanted to do was to see whether or not being, first of all, everybody in the more frustrating situation, the condition said that it was more frustrating, so that was sort of a balance check. But if you are a first-gen student, and after being in one of the two conditions, you're asked just to rate how much you feel like you belong at the institution, it turns out that being in the non-frustrating condition did not impact your belonging, but being in the condition where everything was erased actually impacted your sense of belonging. Now imagine for a second what happens in a person's mind as they're being asked to fill out a routine online form. If I can't even do this simple thing, do I really belong? So the cues for belonging in moments of attributional ambiguity, in moments where things are not going well, in moments where we're just having a hard day, or we're just not sure, the cues are everywhere. And so the skill that I come back to is that ability to perspective take. If we're able to hear the questions that students ask, then potentially we're able to be in a position where we can forestall those negative attributions and allow students to recognize that their uncertainties are actually not a reflection of their innate, individual, and stable inadequacies, that rather that these are normal experiences that we all have, and guess what? They pass with time. They get better. And so that's where the good news is I don't want to leave you on a gloomy note, that there are ways of understanding and leveraging that in moments of ambiguity is also where we have a chance to intervene and create programs and strategies that allows more adaptive attributions. So I'm going to go through very briefly some categories of strategies that our colleagues have done, and hopefully some strategies that you all can take and apply in your own general situations. So the three main channels of interventions to reduce underperformance, again, those are moments in which students are taxed with this uncertainty that impacts their performance, that impacts their engagement, consists of situations that change the cues in the environment. So literally, as we mentioned, there are cues in the environment that students have to interact with. So understanding and changing those is one category of intervention. The second is understanding how to change the subjective lens. It's not just the external cues, but the lens through which we look at those cues that impacts how we interpret those cues. And finally, understanding the role of culture, language, values that we implicitly co-create, and how those can also be leveraged to foster more belonging. So, changing contextual cues. And we're going to look at one very specific example of messaging. The example that I'm going to pull on is a research project that we were invited to take part in when I was at Stanford University. And the administration there said, listen, we have a 99% graduation rate. Can you help us? And I'm like, boo-hoo. But they were really concerned. They had this 1% of the student population that was not graduating, and they wanted to know how they could better support that group. So we said, tell us what happens when these students begin to struggle. They say, well, once they're on sort of academic risk, we send them a probation letter telling them that they need to change their behavior and their outcomes, otherwise they're going to be kicked out. And sort of contrary to what they had hoped would be the impact when the students received this letter, when we sat down with the students and we asked them to take out the parole letter that they got, and how they feel about it, these are the words that sort of came up. Not sort of feelings of gratitude, feelings of empowerment, feelings of connectedness or belonging. Instead, students said that it felt very stressful. It felt shameful. I felt depressed. I felt disappointed, scared. Not exactly the emotions that are conducive of engagement. These are the emotions that are very much predictors of disengagement, of running out of there as quickly as you can. So this was the first insight for the institution, was to realize that the message sent is not the message received. And understanding that was a cornerstone for the intervention that we did, because in working with the institution, we took the standard letter, and there's a lot of lawyers that you have to deal with. So we actually had no room to take anything out. But instead what we did was to include some additional clarifications in the communication that we sent to students in that probation letter that quell the negative questions that they might ask in that moment of vulnerability. So specifically what we did was to validate the very many real reasons why a student might struggle academically, that there could be health reasons, family reasons, financial reasons. It's not just because you're lazy or dumb, which is what they think you think about a student when they get that letter. It's because there are very many real life reasons that happen that could be contributing to your academic challenges. The second thing we did was to normalize the experience. In the first letter, you might see actually that probation is capitalized, almost like a brand. In the revised letter version, we took down the capital P and instead called it the academic probation process. We also wanted to convey that, sort of contrary to what you might think as a Stanford student, you are not the only one who is here or who ever has been. So we tell them that we're going to share with you stories of other students who've also been on probation. The third thing we wanted to do was to add, again, the process, to say that it's not a probation brand, that it is a process. And finally, that the assurance and support of the institution is here and designed exactly to help you in this moment. That we're not here just to evaluate or judge you with this letter, but the intent of this letter is to make sure that you take advantage of the resources that are there. 2 weeks later, when students were assigned to one of the two versions, and students were again randomized to either the sort of practice as usual letter or the revised letter, we found that those in the intervention letter had generally more positive feelings and fewer negative feelings in terms of their prospects at Stanford. So they felt less ashamed, they felt less guilty, and they generally felt more hopeful after getting the revised letter. A year later, when we looked at that same group, they were almost twice as likely to still be engaged if they got the psychologically attuned letter compared to the standard letter. Now here's just an example of understanding a few things that in combination can have a powerful effect. One is understanding timing. When are students going to be asking these questions? Second, what are the questions that they're asking that need to be directly addressed and assuaged so that you're not left to your own devices to make the negative attributions, to make the notion that I don't belong, I'm not smart. It is people like me who can't cut it here. And instead, offer very clear explanations that these are normal experiences and that there is a support culture here to help you get through it. So the timing and the questions are critical in understanding how you can take these principles and apply it in your own work as well. I want to shift now, and again, I apologize for seemingly rushing through things, but I want to give you a sort of a TAPA-style exposure to a number of these domains so that you can take the ones that are most relevant to you and run with those. And of course, I'm happy to stay engaged and continue the conversation after the fact as well. But the first category of interventions were changing the contextual cues. The second is changing the subjective lens. How do you change the attributions that students make in those moments of ambiguity that hopefully will allow them to stay engaged? And here's another sort of broad process of what we intend to do with these interventions. So that is my area of expertise. I'm a psychological interventionist on mindsets. And essentially what we try to do is to change the questions from yes or no types of questions. So am I smart enough? Does this mean I don't belong? And can I trust that I'll be supported? These are yes-no dichotomous kinds of questions that they ask. to process type questions, where instead they can ask themselves, how can I become smarter? How can I develop my belonging? And how can I find the support and the trust that I need? If you can make this shift, then that's a pretty powerful indication that you're doing something really well. But it begins with understanding that students, A, ask themselves those more dichotomous kinds of questions, and they constantly look for validation and confirmation that they don't belong, that they're not smart enough, because adaptively that's what actually helps to protect us, and instead changing the nature of the question to getting them to ask, how can I, instead of do I or do I not? I'm going to talk to you very quickly about a pretty large-scale belonging intervention that my colleagues and I have pioneered and implemented for a few years. And this is essentially the belonging uncertainty intervention. The goal here is to normalize the challenges and uncertainties that students have in their transitions into college. And how we do that is not by telling them that you belong, but instead showing them testimonials and stories from upperclassmen who have gone through that transition and are sharing their own stories about those ambiguities and those uncertainties. So here's a story from a student that a student might see. When I first got to school name, I worried that I was different from other students. Everyone else seemed so certain that they were right for the school, yet I wasn't sure if I fit in. Sometime after my first year, I came to realize that many people come to school uncertain whether or not they fit in or not. Now it seems ironic. Everybody feels they are different freshman year from everybody else, when really, in at least some ways, we're all pretty similar. Now, I've been doing this work and doing this presentation for a while, and it feels just as potent to me seeing it today as I did the first time. And I'll tell you why. When we do these interventions with students, and we get them to realize that they are essentially holding all these uncertainties to themselves, all the while everybody else is feeling that same way, in that moment of realization, there's a very immense and powerful experience that happens. We actually call it the Stanford Duck Syndrome. You might have heard of it, but essentially it's a metaphor for how students see themselves and others as ducks gliding across the surface of the water. But what they don't see for other students, that they do see for themselves, is that they're paddling fiercely to stay afloat. But they look around, they're like, all these other ducks, they've got it together. All the while, you are also not demonstrating that you're struggling, so the person standing next to you is wondering, they've got it together, so maybe I won't speak about my uncertainties. And so we're creating this collective reality that is not based on reality at all. And that's a powerful thing to realize for students, to realize that we're all going through this together. Because absent that, again, left to your own devices, if I know that I'm struggling, if I get a bad grade, if I have an ambiguous interaction with my professor, and I don't have any other explanation, then I conclude that this must mean that I don't belong, that I can't do it, I shouldn't be here. But if I realize everybody's kind of going through it, and that these things are actually a part of the experience of transitioning, not a reflection of your internal and innate skills or deficiencies, and that these things get better over time, then that can be a powerful combination of insights that shifts that question of do I or do I not belong to how do I come to find belonging. And again, some data, I'll go through it quickly, I promise. When these interventions are done, they tend to work best with those groups that contend with the negative stereotypes most aggressively. So if you are in an institution and you really don't know if you belong, absent any other information, there's negative stereotypes about you or your group, then these interventions seem to mitigate the achievement gaps for some of those groups, reducing some performance outcomes by as much as 50%. I can't take credit for this work. There are my colleagues that have done this, but the papers are out there and I'm happy to share with you. So how do you get the belonging message right? There's some core principles, as I mentioned. You want that trifecta of combinations that includes the normalization, to realize, to convey that what you're going through is A, common, and B, a nature of the transition, and not a reflection of who you are and what you're able to, in combination with the realization that these things get better over time. That combination seems to be the optimal messaging for students. It does not work when you tell students on a sort of big landscape placard or billboard that you belong. Now, I raise this issue because we're seeing this happen a lot now. We're actually seeing students being told that they belong 100 times before they even step foot on campus. After a while, they might start to question, like, should I wonder if I belong, if I'm being told that I belong over and over and over again? And unfortunately, that's not the best strategy. As I've mentioned earlier, the best strategy is to create affordances where a student can feel that they are heard and seen and cared for. And that happens best through inquiry, interested inquiry, where you ask questions, where you learn about the student, where you perspective take. That's how you foster belonging, not through these big strategies. The other categories of strategies is to recognize that these attributions typically happen pretty early. So knowing that timing is critical, the earlier you can intervene, the better. Telling someone to belong, actually, as I mentioned, arouses that deficit model, that deficit mindset that you're already not doing something well, that you're not demonstrating what you should. And instead, when we do this work, whether it's in focus groups, whether it's in these online activities, we tell students that they're here not as the recipients of an intervention. We actually tell them that you're being employed by us, the researchers in the institution, because you are, at this moment, the world's foremost expert of what it's like to be a college student on this campus at this time. So we need to learn from you so that we can better prepare the next cohort of students about what challenges and ambiguities and uncertainties they might navigate so that they can be better prepared. When you take that sort of perspective and position of the student being the beneficiary to the benefactor, all of a sudden you lower those defenses, because in addition to telling them that we're going to share something with you, you're not telling them that we think you're deficient in this domain that's critical. Instead, you say, you are an expert. We need to learn from you, so please tell us, what are the common challenges that you're going through? And then they open up and they understand that what they're going through is actually common and shared. The other way that we get them to internalize the message, and if anyone has children, you know that it's very hard to tell them to do something and actually learn that insight. But sometimes when they come up and they say it themselves, it's very hard to convince them otherwise. So how do you get people to internalize message? You get them to talk about it for themselves. So in these interventions, we again say that you are the expert. So please tell us what your transition is like. What are the challenges? And what strategies would you recommend to other students? And once they've done this, they become the owners of that idea. It's now my idea. I thought of it. I wrote it. I said it. And this slightly manipulative, but there's a lot of work on dissonance theory. So the classic work on dissonance, they brought these poor participants into the lab and they said, in the one condition, in all conditions, they said, we're going to get you to write on this blackboard a very long sentence over and over and over again for about 20 minutes. And as these poor participants were leaving, in the one condition, they said, thank you for doing that, but before leaving, can you tell the other person who's standing in the waiting room that you actually enjoyed this experience? And so all participants did this, but what they varied was either we'll give you $20 to tell that person that it wasn't that bad, or we'll give you $1 to tell that person that it was not that bad. And a week later, when they asked these same participants to come back in, the group that was paid $1 was more likely to want to come back in, despite having done this really very boring, very unappealing exercise, because they were only paid $1 to then lie about it. And so absent any clear justification for why I lied to this other person, it must have been not that bad. So we have these conclusions about the things that we do because we want to be consistent, and this is one of the ways that you get messages to be internalized. You allow people to say it of their own volition and really take the sense of ownership that these were my ideas, these are my thoughts. Of course, it's guided in a way that allows them to have that sense. I'll also mention very quickly that we have been now thinking about how to take these activities out of the lab. And so what we're doing now is we're creating collaborations where faculty and advisors are creating and facilitating exchanges with students, where all students can see that the common challenges are shared and that they pass with time. And we're trying to convert some of these mindset strategies into a curriculum for students where they can, again, take those nuggets that are most useful. I've been given the 5-minute warning, so I'm just going to show you one of those modules that I think is relevant to what we're talking about here. We've been talking about resilience and grit a fair bit, but one of the things that I think is implicit, one of those hidden questions that students ask themselves in this current national landscape is that maybe I ought to be resilient in order to be a successful student. But implicit in that is that resilience means independent, individual ruggedness, that when things get hard, I've got to figure it out by myself. That's one of the underlying beliefs that they have that cause students to feel like I've got to figure it out on my own, which we know is not resilient. So in the training that we do with students, we actually address that quite directly, and we say that resilience is not a characteristic of the individual. It is a quality of the networks that you build. That resilient networks are the only way that people are able to pull themselves out of a rut. If you have nothing left to give, you have nothing left to give by definition. You can't just find more to give. When you observe resilience in the wild, resilient people are the ones that lean on each other early so that they don't fall into those deep wells of struggle. So, as we think about belonging, I want to leave you with the reminder that belonging ultimately is a feeling, and that there is very, very many diverse paths to get to that feeling. But ultimately, unless we're connected and interested in how the students' subjective experiences are on a day-to-day basis, we might miss the mark on what we're doing and whether we're having the impact that we want. So with that, I'll pause, and I think we have time for questions. Yeah, great. Great, I'll open up, and again, if you didn't already do it, let's connect.
Thank you so much for your presentation today. My reason for being here today is because I work with faculty. I hire our adjunct faculty for my institution, and I have always known that this information that's being shared at this conference is something that our students need, but then also how do we get our faculty on board. So I saw at the very end of one of your slides that you do have currently some faculty in a law program or law school, I guess working with students, but have you all developed maybe even a training program for faculty to get them involved or get them to be aware of this need for belonging and how they can create or embed that into their curriculum and what they do when they're working with students?
Yeah, great question. And I'll say that as a primary researcher, especially on topics that will have real-world implications, the hope is always to release these interventions into the wild, into the hands of the practitioners who really can become creative. But that being said, I think it's the core principles that matter the most. As I sort of mentioned earlier, the key skill in fostering belonging is that perspective taking, which can be generalized, can be implemented in different ways. And so understanding how you can employ with faculty to do that, I would say, is one of the strategies that we do. The other is recognizing that faculty really are the culture creators in the classroom, that they play a critical role in the experiences of their students. Also lends value to, I think, what we're talking about, how do we bring in the faculty to do this more effectively. The challenge is being able to ensure that the faculty are not putting the onus of change, and this is something I think about anytime there's an intervention, which is to ask, where is the onus of change being placed? That the faculty don't place the onus of change on the students. And you're seeing this a lot with growth mindset now. So faculty now know that having a growth mindset is good. So what they'll often do is tell a student, hey, having a growth mindset is good, so you should have one. Not the best way, right? But now, on top of telling the student that they need to have a growth mindset, there's also an expectation that a good student will demonstrate a growth mindset. So 20 years ago, a faculty or educator would have neglected those students who were not smart enough. Today, that same neglect can happen if you don't think that the student has a growth mindset, because they have a very convenient way of saying, I've done my part, right? So all that to say that I think faculty are critical It happens best when there's an institutional transformation collaboration that really allows the faculty not just to be told what to do, but to understand why they're doing what they're doing, and to feel like they're a contributor in the effort as well. Because I think faculty, just like students, are often told what to do, and that puts them in a difficult position. So I agree. I think faculty are that next frontier of work like this, but it's thoughtful work that needs to happen. I'm happy to connect with you. We have some best practices, because whenever I do professional development with faculty, you'll get 10% who are like really keen about the theory, and the other 90% are like, just tell me what to do. So we have both. And I have a small guidebook of core practices that any faculty can take and implement. One very, I think, flexible and creative application of some of these principles is when we think about that first day of class, where we set the norms and expectations about what our exchange and our partnership will be based on. As you hand out the syllabus, literally a legal document, that tells students that your value in my class is based on your performance on these metrics, as opposed to putting that aside for a moment, saying something about yourself that humanizes you, and inviting students to co-create some shared goals in that class. And then you also see some more very specific strategies, like one of the strategies that seems to work really well is when faculty change their office hours to drop-in hours. A slight shift in that name changes the nature of what I expect that interaction to be. Office hours means I need to be prepared with smart questions when I go to see my professor. Drop-in hours means I can just drop in, maybe just chat. And that actually brings students more into the classroom. So there's a whole bunch of like very specific strategies. There's a broad principles, which I think we need to aspire towards, and then there's a collaboration that makes it sustainable. And that's where I think the real meat is at. Yeah. Great question, yeah, thank you. Last session, I understand. So I don't want to hold anyone behind. Please, if you want to connect, tell me about what you're doing. Let's connect on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to stick around a little bit towards the end if anybody has additional questions. But thank you all for being here and the work that you're doing.